On April 5, 1933, the President of the United States signed a document that made it a federal crime for an American citizen to own gold. Write that sentence again, slowly, because every word of it is true. Not gold stolen from someone. Not gold smuggled past customs. Gold you had earned, saved, and locked in your own bank box. The coins your grandfather left you, the bullion you had bought with taxed wages, the gold certificates the government itself had printed with a promise on their face. Under Executive Order 6102, Americans were commanded to deliver their gold to the Federal Reserve within weeks. The penalty for refusal, a fine of up to $10,000, roughly $250,000 in today's money, or up to 10 years in federal prison, or both. For the following 4 decades, longer than the entire Cold War would last, it remained illegal for ordinary Americans to own monetary gold. A right that citizens of nearly every civilization in recorded history had taken for granted, a right Americans had held since before there was an America, vanished with the stroke of a pen. No constitutional amendment, no great national debate. In fact, when the order was signed, Congress had barely finished reading the law it was based on, a law passed in a single day, in an atmosphere one congressman compared to wartime, by representatives, many of whom admitted they had not seen the text. And here is what makes the story stranger still. The president who signed the order was 1 month into his term. The legal authority he invoked was a wartime statute from 1917, written to fight the Kaiser's Germany. And within a year of collecting the nation's gold at the official price of $20.67 an ounce, the government raised the price to $35. Instantly, by proclamation, booking for itself a paper profit measured in billions, and reducing the gold value of every dollar in every American's pocket by over 40%, to some Americans, then and now, this was the moment the United States government reached into private life and took what did not belong to it. The founding crime of modern money. To others, including many of the economists who have studied the Great Depression most deeply, it was the single most effective act of economic rescue in American history. The decision that stopped the deflationary spiral, restarted the economy, and quite possibly saved American democracy in a decade when democracies were dying around the world. Both camps are looking at the same documents. Both cannot be entirely right. And the questions the episode raises have never been settled, only postponed. What is a dollar actually? Who owns the money in your hands? You or the state that printed it? What can a government legally do to your property when it declares an emergency? And why did the wealthiest nation on earth conclude, in the spring of 1933, that its survival required criminalizing a metal? To answer any of that, we need to understand something modern audiences almost never truly grasp: what money was before 1933. Because the world we are about to enter did not merely use gold. It believed in gold the way societies believe in constitutions and creeds. And it is impossible to understand why taking it away felt like sacrilege, or why it may have been necessary. Until you understand the faith itself, take out a bill from your wallet and look at it. It is money because the government says so, and because everyone around you agrees to act as if it is. Nothing stands behind it but that agreement. Economists call it fiat currency, money by decree, and you have used it your entire life, which is precisely why the world before 1933 is so hard to see. In that world, the paper was not the money. The paper was a receipt. Under the gold standard as Americans knew it, the dollar was defined, by law, not metaphor, as a fixed weight of gold, roughly 1/20th of a troy ounce, which is where that oddly precise price of $20.67 an ounce comes from. A $20 bill and a $20 gold coin were two forms of the same thing, and the government stood ready to swap one for the other on demand. Gold certificates, handsome bills printed with gold-colored seals, said so explicitly on their face, payable to the bearer in gold coin. Americans did not simply trust this promise, they lived it. Gold coins circulated in daily commerce. The gleaming double eagle worth $20, the eagle at 10, the half and quarter eagles, passed across shop counters, paid out in wages, given as wedding gifts and christening presents, hoarded in coffee tins and mattresses by people who had learned, through repeated searing experience, to trust metal over institutions. The most magnificent of those coins carries its own story, and it will matter at the end of ours. In 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt, who held opinions on everything, emphatically decided that American coinage was an aesthetic embarrassment unworthy of a great nation, and personally recruited the country's most celebrated sculptor, Augustus St. Gaudens, to redesign it. The two conspired like schoolboys over what Roosevelt cheerfully called his pet crime, dreaming of coins in high relief like ancient Greece. St. Gaudens, dying of cancer, poured his final strength into the commission, and the result, released in 1907, was the $20 double eagle that bears his name. Liberty striding out of the sunrise with torch and olive branch, an eagle crossing the sun on the reverse, by wide consensus the most beautiful coin the United States ever issued. The first high-relief strikings were so sculptural that banks complained they would not stack, and the relief was flattened for commerce. An early omission of the motto, "In God We Trust." Roosevelt considered putting God's name on money close to blasphemy, ignited a public storm until Congress ordered the motto restored. For a quarter century, that coin was the physical face of the American dollar, a golden object the paper merely represented. Hold the image, liberty in gold, striding into the light. In 1933, the government would order her melted by the hundreds of thousands, and the handful that escaped the crucible would become the most valuable coins on earth. And that trust was not superstition. It was memory. The generation of 1933 or their parents had lived through the collapse of unbacked paper before. Confederate currency had died in their grandparents' hands. The greenbacks of the Civil War had sunk deep below par before redemption was restored. Across the Atlantic, within living memory, Germans had watched the mark dissolve in the great hyperinflation of 1923, wheelbarrows of paper for a loaf of bread, photographs that ran in every American newspaper. Gold, whatever its inconveniences, could not be printed. That single physical fact was the anchor of the entire monetary civilization of the 19th century. A government on the gold standard had surrendered the power to inflate, and that surrender was the point. It was a constitution for money, a chain the state had wrapped around its own hands and locked in front of its citizens. For roughly 4 decades before the First World War, the era historians call the classical gold standard. Most of the commercial world ran on this system, anchored by London, and its achievements were real. Exchange rates between the great trading nations barely moved for a generation. Capital flowed across borders with a freedom the world would not see again for a century. Long-term interest rates in the leading economies fell to levels that suggest bond markets expected the system to last forever. If you had asked an educated man in 1910 whether civilized nations would ever abandon gold, the question would have struck him the way asking whether nations might abandon arithmetic would strike you. But the faith had a shadow side, and it fell on debtors, which in America meant, above all, farmers. Here is the mechanism, and it matters for everything that follows. Under a gold standard, the money supply is tethered to the stock of gold, which grows only as fast as miners can dig. When an economy grows faster than its gold, as America's did, ferociously, in the late 19th century, prices must fall to compensate. Deflation. And deflation, which sounds pleasant, is a silent transfer of wealth from everyone who owes money to everyone who is owed it. The farmer who borrowed to plant when wheat fetched $1 must repay when wheat fetches 60 cents. The debt is fixed in dollars, but the dollars have grown heavier, and he must sell half again as much of his life's work to earn each one. Multiply that across the crop-lean South and the mortgaged plains, decade after falling price decade, and you get one of the great political firestorms of American history. The money question of the late 19th century, the demand of indebted farmers to expand the currency with silver, and the moment it reached its crescendo. The Democratic Convention of 1896, where William Jennings Bryan brought the hall to a frenzy with a closing image of mankind crucified upon a cross of gold. Bryan lost, gold won, new discoveries in South Africa and the Klondike eased the pressure, and the gold standard entered the 20th century seemingly vindicated. Hold on to that 19th century lesson, because 1933 is that story again at 10 times the voltage. Falling prices, fixed debts, ruined debtors, and a political system deciding this time to break the chain rather than the borrowers. There was one more strand woven through the entire economy, so ordinary that almost no one thought about it, which would soon become the most litigated sentence in America. The gold clause. Written into railroad bonds, corporate debts, mortgages, and government securities by the millions boilerplate in an enormous share of long-term contracts, it promised that the debt would be repaid in gold coin of the present standard of weight and fineness. It existed precisely because creditors remembered the greenbacks. Whatever happened to paper, the bond would be paid in metal. By 1933, obligations carrying gold clauses amounted to a sum on the order of $100 billion in an economy whose entire annual output had fallen below $60 billion. File that ratio away. It is a bomb, and it goes off in Act 5. This, then, was the monetary world of the American mind on the eve of the Depression. Gold is constitution, gold is memory, gold is the one promise that could not be broken. To imagine the government seizing it was to imagine the government seizing the alphabet. Then the Depression came, and the faith began to kill the faithful. The Great Depression did not begin as a gold crisis. It became one through a mechanism so cruel in its logic that economists would spend the next 90 years dissecting it. Start with the crash of 1929 and the slide that followed. Output collapsing, prices collapsing faster. Between 1929 and 1933, the general price level in the United States fell by roughly a quarter, and farm prices by half or more. Now replay the farmer's arithmetic from 1896, but harder. Every debt in America, every mortgage, every crop lien, every corporate bond grew heavier in real terms with each falling month, while the incomes that serviced those debts evaporated. Economists call it debt deflation, after the economist Irving Fisher, who described it while living it. He had ridden the boom, proclaimed stocks at a permanently high plateau days before the crash, and lost a fortune, and then, from the wreckage of his reputation, produced the theory of the disaster that had ruined him. Borrowers default, lenders fail. Failing lenders call loans and dump collateral. The dumping drives prices lower still. The lower prices deepen every remaining debt. The economy was not merely shrinking, it was eating itself, and the bank stood at the center of the meal. American banking entered the Depression as a sprawl of tens of thousands of mostly small, mostly undiversified banks, and from 1930 onward they failed in waves, thousands upon thousands of them, each failure vaporizing depositors' savings, because deposit insurance did not exist. Each wave taught the survivors' customers the same lesson. Get your money out first. And in a gold standard country, get your money out had a final fatal meaning. Paper could fail, banks could fail, gold could not. So as confidence rotted, Americans did the individually rational, collectively catastrophic thing. They converted deposits to cash and cash to gold. The gold went into safe deposit boxes, coffee tins, and holes in the ground. Watch what this does to the whole machine. Under the gold standard, gold was the base of the banking system, the reserve on which the pyramid of credit stood. Every double eagle withdrawn and buried was high-powered money pulled out of the system's foundations, forcing a multiplied contraction of lending above it. Hoarding did not just express the crisis. It accelerated it, mechanically. The country was caught in a doom loop between its money and its fear, and the gold standard, the chain the state had locked on its own hands, guaranteed that the state could not print its way out. The Federal Reserve, watching gold drain abroad and underground, faced the standard's iron logic. Defend the dollar's gold parity with tight money in the middle of a deflation, or watch the anchor of the currency wash away. Modern scholarship Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz on the monetary collapse, Barry Eichengreen on what he called the golden fetters, has largely converged on a devastating verdict. The gold standard was the transmission mechanism of the Great Depression, the wire along which failure traveled from country to country, and recovery, nation by nation, began almost precisely when each government cut the wire. Britain was forced off gold in September 1931, and Britain's early exit bought it a milder depression. Dozens of countries followed. By early 1933, the United States was one of the last great economies still chained to the mast, and the ship was underwater. Then came the winter of 1932-33, the interregnum, and the peculiar constitutional cruelty of its timing. Franklin Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover in November 1932, but under the calendar then in force, the new president would not take office until March 4. For 4 months, a repudiated administration governed a collapsing country, while the incoming one declined to co-sign policies it had not made. Hoover wrote to Roosevelt, pressing him to promise, publicly, that he would defend the gold standard. Roosevelt, keeping every option open, said nothing. And into that vacuum of authority the banking system fell. The atmosphere of that winter is easy to forget and essential to feel. This was not a financial story unfolding in a stable country. It was a stable country visibly coming apart. Farm foreclosure sales were being stopped by armed crowds. Hunger marches converged on city halls. Respectable voices in respectable journals mused openly about whether the crisis had outgrown democracy itself, and pointed, some in dread, some in admiration, at the strongmen rising in Europe. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany that same January, 5 weeks before Roosevelt's inauguration. The two men would take power within 33 days of each other, each inheriting a depression, and the decade would be a race between their answers. And on the night of February 15, 1933, in Miami, the American side of that race nearly ended before it began. A drifter named Giuseppe Zangara fired 5 shots at President-elect Roosevelt from point-blank range in a crowd. Roosevelt was untouched. Chicago's Mayor Anton Cermak, standing beside the car, was fatally wounded. Had Zangara's arm not been jostled, everything in the rest of this story, the holiday, the order, the New Deal itself, belongs to an alternate history no one can write. Contemporaries understood exactly how close it had been. The country entered March 1933 with its banks failing, its incoming president nearly murdered, and its confidence in institutions scraping a level never measured before or since. The final run began in earnest in February 1933. Michigan declared a statewide bank holiday on Valentine's Day, freezing the accounts of a great industrial state, and the panic went national, state after state slamming bank doors by proclamation as governors raced the mobs in their own lobbies. Now the run acquired its most dangerous form, a run on the dollar itself. Depositors, corporations, and foreign holders converted balances to gold at an accelerating pace. In the final weeks, the Federal Reserve watched hundreds of millions of dollars in gold, an enormous share of its free reserves, drain out into hoards and foreign accounts. The New York Fed fell below its legal gold reserve ratio in the very hours before the inauguration. By the morning of March 4, 1933, as Roosevelt stood to take the oath, the governors of nearly every state had closed or restricted their banks. The richest nation on earth had, functionally, no banking system. Its money was hiding from its own economy. That morning, before the crowds at the Capitol, Roosevelt delivered the sentence everyone remembers, that fear itself was the enemy. Fewer remember the sentences of that speech aimed like artillery. The money changers had fled the temple, and he would ask Congress, if need be, for wartime powers against the emergency. The crowd's loudest roar of the day, observers noted with some unease, came for the promise of wartime powers. He was not bluffing about the wartime part, and this is one of the great overlooked hinges of American history. Buried in the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, a statute written to strangle Germany's finances, lay a provision permitting the president to regulate or prohibit transactions in gold and currency during wartime. A handful of advisors had concluded that the phrase could be stretched, that the emergency clause might be read to reach a peacetime crisis. It was, to put it gently, an aggressive reading. It had been prepared quietly in the transition's final days. On the night of March 5-6, 1933, one day into his presidency, Roosevelt invoked the 1917 statute to proclaim a national bank holiday. Every bank in the United States closed by federal order. And read the proclamation's fine print: the export, hoarding, and earmarking of gold prohibited. The gold program did not begin on April 5. It began before the new president had unpacked, smuggled inside the emergency. Everyone was begging him to meet. What followed was the most extraordinary week in the history of American economic government. Congress convened an emergency session on March 9 and received the Emergency Banking Act, drafted at speed by exhausted men, some of them Hoover's own Treasury holdovers working for their old adversary's successor. The bill ratified the holiday and the gold restrictions retroactively, empowered the Treasury to compel delivery of gold, and authorized the machinery to reopen the banks under federal license. The House passed it by acclamation, sight unseen in many cases, members famously voting on a bill of which the chamber had, at best, a single marked-up copy, and the Senate followed within hours. Roosevelt signed it that evening. Total elapsed time from introduction to law. One day, the week of the holiday produced some of the strangest economic scenes in American history, worth a moment before the famous broadcast. A modern economy simply stopped having money. Businesses could not make payroll. Travelers were stranded mid-journey with checks no one could cash. Hotels and department stores extended courtesy credit to any customer with a respectable face. The whole country abruptly thrown back onto the storekeeper's ledger, improvising trust the way its grandparents had. Communities responded by printing their own. Hundreds of cities, chambers of commerce, and corporations issued emergency scrip, locally honored promissory paper, by the hundreds of millions of dollars, and folklore of the episode still treasures its oddities, like the California beach town remembered for accepting clamshells. Meanwhile, at the marble counters of the Federal Reserve banks, the panic ran in reverse in the most literal way imaginable. The same citizens who had queued in February to take gold out queued in March to hand it back, sacks and satchels of coins sliding over the counters, some depositors reportedly anxious most of all that their names not appear on any hoarder's list. Photographers caught the lines. Editors savored the moral. Fear had moved money out of the system. Fear of a different kind and hope, and a new president's voice was moving it back. 3 nights later, on March 12, Roosevelt sat before radio microphones for the first fireside chat and did something no president had quite done before. He explained banking to the nation, simply, calmly, like a neighbor, why the banks had closed, what had been fixed, and why, when the doors opened in the morning, the reopened banks would be safe. It may be the single most successful speech in the history of American finance, measured by the only metric that matters. The next morning, in city after city, the lines outside the banks were lines to put money back in. Deposits and, remarkably, gold flowed back over the counters by the hundreds of millions. Some of it was relief. Some of it was the fine print. Hoarders had been put on notice, and the Federal Reserve began preparing to publish the names of those who had withdrawn gold and not returned it. The combination of reassurance and quiet menace worked. The system steadied, and there, with the panic broken, the story could have stopped. The banks were open. The emergency, in its acute form, had passed. What happened next was therefore not firefighting. It was a decision, the real one, the one this documentary is about, because Roosevelt and the men around him had concluded that the problem was not the panic. The problem was the anchor. Prices had to rise, debts had to be lightened, farms saved, the deflation machine thrown into reverse, and prices could not durably rise while every dollar remained a fixed claim on a 20th of an ounce of gold that citizens could demand at any window. To reflate the dollar, the government first had to own the gold, all of it, and extinguish, permanently, the citizens' right to call the government's bluff. Okay, so on April 5, 1933, Executive Order 6102 was signed, under the authority Congress had ratified in that one-day statute. Its command was plain. All persons were required to deliver on or before May 1, 1933, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates to a Federal Reserve Bank or member bank, receiving in exchange $20.67 per ounce, the old parity in the new paper. The exemptions traced a careful line, up to $100 in gold coin per person, about 5 ounces. Gold coins of recognized special value to collectors, jewelry and gold used in industry, art, and dentistry. The penalties were the ones we began with. Up to $10,000, up to 10 years, or both. It is worth being precise here because this episode attracts myth like a magnet. This was not, in the literal sense, confiscation without payment. Every ounce delivered was paid for, at the full legal price of the day, in legal tender. No agents went door to door, no safe deposit boxes were forcibly drilled by roving squads, whatever later legend claims. What the order did was end the exchangeability of that payment. The paper received could no longer be turned back into gold. And the deeper reckoning arrived 9 months later, when the same government that had collected gold at $20.67 repriced it at $35, a 41% devaluation of the dollar against gold, applied after the citizens' gold was already in the vaults. The sequence, not the delivery, is the grievance that has echoed for 90 years. First the metal was gathered at the old price, then the price was changed. Whether one calls that prudent monetary management or a swindle executed in 2 legal steps depends to this day on what one believes a dollar is. Okay, so before we follow the gold into the vaults, meet the men who took it there, because the cast of this drama is stranger than fiction would dare. Start with the Treasury Secretary who signed off on the mechanics of the gold program. William Woodin, a Republican industrialist, president of a great railcar company, who happened also to be a serious composer of published music. Newspapers delighted in the incongruity. The man overseeing the most drastic monetary surgery in American history wrote songs, and in the frantic reopening week he was reported dashing between crisis meetings, having barely slept, cheerfully improvising, his words solutions such as the emergency printing of currency to stock the reopening banks. Frail, tiny beloved even by opponents, Woodin was dying as he served. Within a year illness forced him out, and he was replaced by the man whose diaries preserve this era's most famous scenes. Henry Morgenthau, Jr., the loyal neighbor and farm credit administrator who would hold the Treasury for the rest of the decade. Then there is the professor. George Warren of Cornell was an agricultural economist, a farm management expert, whose life's data had convinced him of a simple, almost mechanical proposition. Commodity prices track the price of gold, so to raise the prices farmers received, one need only raise the price of gold. Mainstream economists regarded the theory as somewhere between oversimplified and quackery, and regarded Warren's sudden intimacy with the president with open horror. But Roosevelt, a Hudson Valley squire who thought naturally in terms of farm prices, found in Warren exactly what he wanted, a credentialed theory that said the thing he had already decided to do would work. Through the autumn of 1933, in one of the most surreal rituals in the history of central banking, the price of gold was set daily over Roosevelt's breakfast tray, with Morgenthau and officials in attendance and Warren's charts nearby, the government bidding gold upward through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to push the dollar down and prices up. Morgenthau's diary preserves the morning. The president chose an increase of 21 cents and explained, with a grin, that it was a lucky number, 3 times 7. Morgenthau confided to his diary something to the effect that if people knew how the price was actually being fixed, they would be frightened. The passage has been quoted by critics of managed money ever since, and fairly, it is also worth adding what the critics sometimes omit, that the breakfast table period was brief, that the daily theatrics mattered less than the destination, and that the destination was chosen and reached. A dollar cheap enough to lift the price level off the ocean floor. Around these men, the old guard broke in public and in private. Roosevelt's own budget director, Lewis Douglas, a fiscal conservative to his bones, reacted to the decision to leave gold with a despairing prophecy, reported by colleagues in words to the effect that it meant the end of Western civilization, and eventually resigned. Senator Carter Glass of Virginia, co-author of the Federal Reserve itself, condemned the gold policy with a fury that stopped just short of apoplexy. To men of his generation, repudiating gold was not policy but dishonor, a defaulting nation breaking its sealed word. Across the water, John Maynard Keynes, who had years earlier dismissed the gold standard as a barbarous relic, applauded from the opposite trench, declaring himself thrilled that a great nation was finally putting its people above its parity, even as he winced at the breakfast table method, comparing the dollar's erratic managed hops to something like a gold standard on the booze. And Wall Street's most theatrical verdict came from the banker James Warburg, who had served the administration and broken with it. Sound money men, he suggested, were being asked to accept alchemy. They were all describing the same 3 documents. In June 1933, Congress by joint resolution abrogated the gold clauses, every one of them in private contracts and in the government's own bonds, that $100 billion bomb we planted earlier, declaring such clauses against public policy and unenforceable, payable instead dollar for dollar in legal tender. In January 1934, the Gold Reserve Act completed the architecture. Title to the entire gold stock of the Federal Reserve passed to the United States Treasury. The dollar was fixed at the new gold weight, $35 to the ounce. For governments and central banks only, never again for citizens, and the revaluation's accounting gain, on the order of $2.8 billion, was booked to the Treasury, part of it seeding a new and quietly powerful instrument called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which exists to this day. And to house the nation's now nationalized hoard, the Treasury built, on an army post in Kentucky, a fortress whose name became a synonym for impregnability itself, the United States Bullion Depository at Fort Knox, completed in 1936, receiving its first great gold shipments by armed train in 1937. Gold of the American people, the double eagles from the coffee tins, the certificates from the mattresses, was melted into bars and buried, by its new owner behind granite and machine guns in Kentucky. The Supreme Court had its say in February 1935 in the Gold Clause cases, and its say was one of the strangest split decisions in the court's history. On private contracts, the court upheld the abrogation. Congress's power over the monetary system prevailed over private gold promises. On the government's own bonds, the court, 5-4, found that Congress had indeed broken the nation's promise, and then held that the bondholders had suffered no measurable damages, since gold could no longer be lawfully held anyway, and so could collect nothing. Repudiation without remedy. Justice McReynolds, leading the 4 furious dissenters, delivered an oral protest so bitter that its most quoted line, a lament that the Constitution was gone, does not even appear in the written opinion. Roosevelt, for his part, had prepared for defeat in a way few realize. A draft radio address existed in which the court ruled the other way and detonated the debt structure. The president was prepared to announce in effect that he would not enforce the ruling. It was never delivered, but its existence tells you how close the constitutional order came, in 1935, to a collision that makes the later court-packing fight look like a garden party. And what of the citizens, the actual holders of the actual coins? Here the record is quieter than the legend, and more interesting. Prosecutions under the gold orders were remarkably few, and the very first great test case collapsed in a way that must have caused exquisite embarrassment. A New York attorney named Frederick Barber Campbell, who refused to surrender several thousand ounces held at Chase, was prosecuted, and the court held that the particular order in question was defective, because the statute had authorized the president to act, and the operative order bore the wrong signature chain, having issued from the Treasury Secretary. The government's response was not to relent, but to repaper. New orders and, soon, the Gold Reserve Act sealed every seam. Thereafter, the state showed little appetite for hunting grandmother's coin jars, and Americans showed a corresponding discretion. Numismatic historians and treasury data agree on the essential point. A very large fraction of the gold coinage, by serious estimates, a substantial share of all the gold coins then outstanding, was never turned in at all. It stayed in the tins in the ground, was quietly sold abroad, or slipped into the exempt category of collector pieces, a category whose boundaries proved conveniently elastic. The Great Gold Roundup of 1933 was, in practice, largely voluntary, substantially evaded, and almost never punished, a fact that sits awkwardly with both the tyranny legend and the compliance legend. The truth is more American than either. The law thundered, the citizens hedged, and everyone found it convenient not to look too closely. It is worth pausing on the safe deposit box, because it is where the legend and the record diverge most sharply. The durable myth holds that boxes were sealed and searched, their gold seized by federal agents. The documented reality is narrower, and in its way, more interesting. During the banking emergency, access to boxes was restricted and banks were directed to require declarations. A depositor might open his box in the presence of a bank officer, and gold discovered was to be exchanged, not pocketed by the state without payment. What the government relied upon was not the crowbar, but the choke point. Gold in a box was gold you could not lawfully sell, spend, or export, an asset legally frozen in amber. Time, not force, did the collecting, and for those determined to resist, the practical options traced a quiet map of American ingenuity. The collector exemption stretched to cover coins of dubious rarity, the border across which gold flowed to Canadian and European buyers, and the oldest vault of all, the ground. Metal detectorists to this day turn up caches of double eagles buried in the 1930s by owners who told no one and died with the secret small time capsules of distrust surfacing decade by decade, each one a family's private verdict on Executive Order 6102 delivered in the only ballot they trusted. Clay, which brings us to the coins that became the most valuable objects ever to fall out of this story, the ghosts of 1933 themselves. In the spring of 1933, the Philadelphia Mint had already struck the year's double eagles. Hundreds of thousands of $20 gold pieces, gleaming St. Gaudens designs, arguably the most beautiful coin America ever made. The gold orders came down before they were released. None ever officially entered circulation. The entire mintage was ordered melted into bars. Officially, a 1933 double eagle therefore does not exist. Unofficially, a handful, roughly 20, by later reckonings, walked out of the mint, almost certainly through a cashier's window in a cooperative Philadelphia coin dealer, and began half-lives in the shadows of the coin trade. The Secret Service, our old friend from the counterfeiting wars, spent decades hunting them, seizing specimen after specimen from collectors as stolen government property. One escaped beyond reach in the most cinematic way possible. Purchased in 1944, complete with an export license issued through bureaucratic error, by King Farouk of Egypt, playboy monarch and manic collector. Decades after Farouk's fall, that coin resurfaced in the hands of a British dealer, was seized in a sting at the Waldorf Astoria, survived years of litigation, and was finally sold, by unique legal settlement, the only 1933 double eagle ever to be monetized and lawfully owned, at auction in 2002 for over $7.5 million. In 2021, it sold again, for just under $19 million, the most expensive coin ever auctioned. Meanwhile, a Philadelphia family, descendants of that same 1930s coin dealer, discovered 10 more specimens in a bank box, submitted them to the Treasury for authentication, and watched the government simply keep them. The ensuing lawsuit ran for a decade and ended with the coins confirmed as federal property. 90 years on, the United States government still hunts and still wins. It is the entire story of 1933 in miniature, fought over objects the size of a silver dollar. The state's claim against the citizens' hoard, unresolved, undying, and now worth more per ounce than any gold on earth. Did it work? For 90 years, that question has been fought like a religious war, so let us do what the combatants rarely do and separate what is documented from what is argued. What is documented is the turn. The American economy hit its floor in March 1933 in the very weeks of the bank holiday, and then, from 1933 to 1937, grew at rates rarely seen before or since outside wartime, with industrial production surging off the bottom and prices, at last, rising. The turn in expectations was nearly instantaneous, and shows up everywhere researchers have looked. In commodity markets that leaped within days of the gold moves, in equity prices, and the simple resumption of buying by businesses and households who had been hoarding cash against an endless deflation, and now, for the first time in 4 years, expected tomorrow's prices to be higher than today's. A landmark strand of modern research, associated with the economist Christina Romer, among others, attributes the bulk of the recovery before 1937 not to the alphabet agencies or public works, but to monetary expansion, to the gold. Devaluation made gold worth more dollars. Gold flowed into the United States in a river, from hordes, from abroad, and later from a Europe buying safety as Hitler rose, and every ounce at the new price became fresh base money in a system finally free to expand. On this account, Executive Order 6102 and its sequels were the hinge of the whole rescue. The moment the deflation machine was thrown into reverse. Translate the abstractions into one household to see what the policy actually did. Take a farm family in Iowa carrying a $2,000 mortgage contracted in 1928, when corn was worth several times its 1932 price. Deflation had, in effect, silently rewritten their loan into a far larger one. Same dollars owed, but each dollar now costing triple the corn to earn. Reflation ran the rewrite in reverse. As commodity prices climbed off the 1933 floor, corn and wheat and cotton rising sharply within months of the gold moves, the same $2,000 shrank back toward something a harvest could touch. Multiply by every mortgaged farm and indebted business in America, and you see what the gold program truly was underneath the monetary machinery. The largest debt relief operation in the nation's history, executed without forgiving a single loan, by changing the value of the unit every loan was written in. Creditors understood this perfectly, which is why the era's fiercest opposition came from the bond-holding class and its senators. Debtors understood it too, which is why the farm states that had marched behind Bryan's Cross of Gold in 1896 got, a generation late, almost precisely what he had promised them, delivered not by silver and not by a prairie radical, but by a Hudson Valley aristocrat with a fountain pen, what is argued as everything else. The recovery, though steep, was incomplete. Unemployment remained brutal for years, and a severe relapse in 1937-38, triggered in part by premature tightening, showed how fragile the gains were. Critics then and now insist the same reflation could have been achieved by lawful legislation without criminalizing private ownership, that the ban on citizens' gold was never economically necessary, only politically convenient, foreclosing the public's ability to bet against its own currency. Defenders answer that in March 1933 the run on the dollar was the crisis, and that reflation with a citizen's gold window open is a car with a parking brake welded on. Both positions have serious economists behind them. What no serious account disputes any longer is the international pattern. Country by country, recovery from the Great Depression began when the golden fetters came off, and the countries that clung longest, the gold bloc of France and its partners, suffered longest. Whatever one thinks of the method, the direction has few defenders left. One international detonation belongs in this sequence, because it completed the break with the old world. In the summer of 1933, the great powers gathered in London at a World Economic Conference whose central hope was to stabilize currencies, in effect, to coax the dollar back toward a fixed golden relationship with the pound and franc. Roosevelt, cruising the New England coast, followed the negotiations with mounting irritation, and on July 3 detonated them with a radio message so blunt that it entered history as the bombshell. The United States, he declared in substance, would not surrender its domestic price-raising program for the fetish of stabilized exchange rates. Sound money was money sound for a nation's own economy, not a fixed ratio to someone else's. Delegates were stunned. The conference collapsed. Orthodox opinion across 2 continents pronounced itself appalled, and Keynes, nearly alone, saluted the message publicly as magnificently right. Historians still debate the diplomacy, but the doctrine announced that day was the true epitaph of the classical gold standard. Henceforth, the value of money would answer to national recovery first and international parity second. Every managed currency on Earth today lives inside that sentence. The world that emerged was new, and its newness compounded for decades. At Bretton Woods in 1944, the victors built a global system with the American arrangement at its core. Currencies pegged to the dollar pegged to gold at 35, but redeemable in gold only by foreign governments, never by citizens of anywhere. The dollar became the world's money precisely because it was the last currency with any golden thread at all. Then the thread frayed. Post-war America printed and spent. The gold claims of foreigners swelled past the gold in Kentucky. A consortium of central banks fought a rearguard action in the London gold market through the 1960s and lost, and on the evening of August 15, 1971, interrupting, of all things, the Western broadcast of Bonanza President, Richard Nixon announced that the United States was closing the gold window. Temporarily, he said. The temporary closure is now in its 6th decade. Since that night, for the first sustained period in recorded monetary history, no major currency on Earth has been defined as anything at all except the issuing government's promise. The order signed in April 1933 was the first sentence of that story. August 1971 was merely its final paragraph. Fort Knox itself deserves a closing note because the vault became a character in the national imagination in ways its builders never intended. Sealed, photographed only from outside, guarded by an army post, and, crucially, almost never open to outsiders, it bred exactly what sealed things breed: mythology. Goldfinger made it the ultimate heist target. Generations of skeptics have demanded to know whether the gold is really there, a suspicion the government has addressed only rarely. A congressional and press inspection in 1974, a widely publicized official visit in 2017, each viewing settling the question for some and, by its very rarity, feeding it for others. Behind the theater sits a genuine oddity of the modern system. The United States still holds, at Fort Knox and other depositories, roughly 260 million ounces of gold, still carried on the Treasury's books at an official statutory price of about $42 an ounce. A valuation frozen in the early 1970s, dozens of times below the market. The richest artifact of 1933 sits in Kentucky, deliberately mispriced, monetarily inert, guarded like scripture, and owned by a government whose money has not been convertible into it for over half a century. No one quite knows what it is for anymore. No one will propose selling it. Some objects outlive their function and become something else. Relics, in the exact religious sense, and the American gold hoard may be the largest relic on Earth. 8,000 tons of a faith estate confiscated, then quietly adopted. And the citizens' gold? In one of history's quieter ironies, prohibition outlived its purpose by decades and died of indifference. With the dollar no longer convertible into anything, forbidding Americans to own gold protected nothing. And on the last day of 1974, under President Gerald Ford, the ban simply expired by act of Congress, 41 years after 6102. Americans could once again lawfully own gold, and promptly discovered what the intervening decades had done to the ratio. The metal surrendered at $20.67, repriced to $35, floated after 1971, touched $800 an ounce within 6 years of legalization amid the inflation of the late 70s. Every argument about what 1933 took and what it saved is, in the end, an argument about that price series, and about which counterfactual America you believe in, the one that kept its gold in its deflation, or the one that traded the metal for the recovery. History, as always, ran only one of the experiments, so stand back from the 90 years and look at what this story actually is, because it is bigger than gold. It is, first, a story about the nature of money, maybe the purest one American history offers. In March 1933, two theories of money met in a collapsing economy. In one, money is a thing, scarce, physical, prior to the state, the citizen's final refuge from the government's promises. In the other, money is a tool, a public utility, an instrument of policy, whose worth is whatever serves the Commonwealth's survival. The first theory had the Constitution's authors, a century of practice, and the coins in the coffee tin. The second had the unemployment lines. The second theory won in a week and has governed ever since. Every dollar you have ever spent is its artifact. But the first theory never died. It merely went private, into the vaults of gold buyers, the code of digital currencies, the perennial rumors about Fort Knox, and the enduring half-memory, passed down like folklore, that there was once a year when the government came for the gold. Societies argue longest about the things they settled by force majeure rather than persuasion, and America never persuaded itself about 1933. It simply moved on, with the argument packed in the luggage. It is, second, a story about emergency power, and here the pattern connects to everything else in the hidden history of American institutions. A statute, written for war against the Kaiser, stretched in peacetime to close every bank in America. A Congress ratifying in one day a text it had scarcely read. A president prepared in a desk drawer to defy the Supreme Court. A temporary suspension. Nixon's word in 1971 was temporarily. That becomes the permanent order of the world. None of this is unique to money. It is how states move in crises everywhere and always. The emergency opens a door, the institution walks through, and the door never quite closes again. What makes 1933 remarkable is not that it happened, but that it happened to the most sacred property right in the culture. With the broad consent of the frightened, and that the Republic, this is the part both camps should sit with, survived it, recovered, and voted for its author 3 more times. Emergency power is not a switch that turns democracies into tyrannies. It is a debt that democracies take on, and like all the debts in this era, was never exactly repaid. It was rolled over. The story also refuses to stay in the past tense, and honesty requires saying so. Every major crisis of the modern era reaches back and touches 1933. In 2008 and again in 2020, governments and central banks created money at speeds and scales that would have been legally impossible under the system 6102 destroyed. Actions defended and denounced in vocabulary lifted, sometimes word for word, from the Roosevelt debates. The rise of digital currencies in the last 2 decades is, among other things, a direct descendant of the 1933 grievance. An attempt to engineer, in code, the property the government proved in 1933 it could reach in metal. Money that cannot be summoned to a Federal Reserve counter by executive order. And central banks themselves in recent years have been accumulating gold again at rates unseen in generations. The institutions that manage the fiat system quietly stockpiling the relic it replaced against futures they decline to specify. None of this settles the old argument. All of it proves the argument is alive. Eviscerate a sacred thing by emergency decree, and the emergency ends, the decree expires, the officials die, and the thing stays sacred, waiting. And it is, finally, a story about trust, which is to say the same story as every episode in this series, wearing different metal. The gold standard was a machine for not trusting governments, built by generations who had excellent reasons not to. The system that replaced it is a machine for trusting them totally. Every account balance, every paycheck, every price on earth now rests on nothing but institutional promise-keeping, watched by markets and voters instead of redeemed at a window. 90 years in, the verdict is genuinely mixed and genuinely open. The fiat era has produced both the longest stretch of depression-free prosperity in modern history and the chronic slow inflation that gold standard generations would have regarded as theft on an installment plan. Perhaps that is the honest epitaph for Executive Order 6102. It did not end the argument between the citizens' metal and the state's promise. It decided a round of it, at gunpoint by statute, in the worst month of the worst decade, and then left the argument to us, along with the bars in Kentucky, the ghost coins in their evidence vaults, and the strange paper in every wallet on earth that is money because, and only because, we have all agreed not to ask the question that the spring of 1933 answered by force. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten systems, people, and decisions that shape the modern world, subscribe for more documentaries like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.